Well, hello everybody, and welcome to the April Virtual Planetarium with Pete Lawrence and myself, Paul Abel. And we're going to start, as ever, with the inner solar system, because this isn't going to take long with regards to the planets. Not much about. But one planet that is about, though, is the planet Mercury. Best time to catch it is really the 1st of April, and start looking for it about 40 minutes after sunset.
Yeah.
It's around 100 minutes after sunset, but it's quite a tricky object. It's slowed down and it's not particularly bright, and from then on it gets worse.
It does. It's worth noting that it reaches inferior conjunction on the 11th of April, and after that it'll be in the morning sky, of course. It'll pass 1.7 degrees north of magnitude minus 3.8 Venus on the 19th of April, but as it only rises 20 minutes before the sun, that's going to be quite a tricky thing to see, especially as Mercury will be at magnitude plus 3.2.
Yeah, virtually impossible to see without any optical aid, I think. That's going to be a tough one.
It is.
Moving further out, planet Venus, well, actually rather close to the sun now. Venus is in the opposite situation. It's moving further and further away from us and gradually coming towards superior conjunction. So the sun will lie between us and the planet Venus, and it's really not at all well placed for observation.
No, that rise is 16 minutes before the sun on the 1st of April and 8 minutes before the sun on the 30th of April. I don't know what you're complaining about.
Oh, I just never had it so good, clearly. Mars, well, we really are clutching at straws now.
Yeah.
Best time to see is really 30th of April, if you can catch it. It rises 40 minutes before the sun, but at an altitude of 2 degrees, incredibly low down. So it's going to be quite a challenge to see Mars.
It is. All the planets, just to let everybody who's listening know, are going to be poor over this period, and May and June, and then they start to improve in July. So we are just we're trying to sugarcoat what is not a particularly good situation. Having said that, Jupiter is still with us just about on the 1st of April. It has an altitude of about 23 degrees from about 1920 UT, so 2020 BST. It's not at a very good altitude, but if the skies are clear, we've had such a bad run of weather in the first part of 2024 that any clear nights, just get out there and grab a view of it if you can.
Yeah, it's really been particularly poor. I've never known so much water fall from the sky. At this rate, I think I'm going to have to take up radio astronomy.
I don't think things have really got that desperate, have they?
It could be better. It really could be better. But as you say, Pete, Jupiter's still there in the April twilight. Telescope will show the main equatorial bands and, of course, the Galilean moons.
Yes.
Even though it's slowed down, it's not uncommon at this time of year for good seeing to occur, so you should make the most of it if you do get a clear sky and Jupiter's there.
It's also worth noting that there's a lovely meeting between Jupiter and a slender 5% lit waxing crescent moon on the 10th of April. The beautiful lunar crescent will appear 3.2 degrees to the north of the planet on that occasion, which is really lovely, isn't it? It's a nice thing to see.
It is. It's quite striking, actually, a thin crescent and the brilliant Jupiter. The colour is also quite interesting, because I've often found that the colour of Jupiter is slightly yellowish to the naked eye.
Yes, I know you've mentioned that.
And the crescent, a thin crescent, also has a yellowish look to it, particularly when it's low down.
Yeah, but that's probably because it's coming through the atmosphere. The atmosphere tends to redden the appearance of bright objects because the blue light is getting scattered by a thicker layer of atmosphere, so you're left with the sort of yellows and the reds coming through.
That's true, but I think in Jupiter's case, the yellowish colour is a real one rather than an Earth atmospheric.
If I ever get to see it again, I will actually have to have a look at that. It's also worth noting, because Uranus has been quite close to Jupiter for a while now, and actually the minimum separation between them will occur this month on the 20th and 21st of April, when Jupiter and Uranus will appear half a degree apart. But it's going to be a tricky thing to see because they'll be in a brightish sky, but you might be able to pick it up.
That's quite interesting, because half a degree is about a lunar diameter, and
Yes.
I do have a couple of low-power eyepieces that will fit the whole of the moon in a single field of view. So it ought to be possible then to have Uranus and Jupiter in the same field of view.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's the correct way to do it, to actually, with half a degree, if you've got an eyepiece and you can look at the moon, you can look at the moon all in one go, then you're covered. You've got the right field of view to actually be able to see this pairing occurring. So that's on the evenings of the 20th and 21st of April. It's worth bearing in mind as well that Jupiter will be at magnitude minus 1.8 at the time, and Uranus will be about plus 5.8.
Yeah, so quite a tough thing to see. Next played out, Saturn. Well, it is a morning object, but it's really not very well placed. It's very low in the dawn twilight. A 9% lit waning crescent moon sits just 3.7 degrees southwest of Saturn, which is at magnitude 0.8, on the morning of the 6th of April, so that might be a thing to catch out for. But by the end of the month, Saturn only manages to reach an altitude of some 5 degrees in the dawn twilight. So, well, it's a bit higher than Mars, isn't it?
Well, yes, it's over twice the altitude of Mars, I suppose, if you want to look on the positive side. Okay, well, Uranus, we've already mentioned it really,
Yes.
but it's an evening planet, now on its last legs as it slips slowly but surely into the evening twilight. Uranus is in conjunction with Jupiter on the 20th and 21st of April, but as we said, it's that evening twilight which will make that a very hard conjunction to see properly. Interesting thing to try and image. If you do image it, and you've got a little bit of image scale, so a similar setup that you would use to take a picture of the entire disk of the moon, for example. If you can get Jupiter and Uranus in your camera, turn your tracking off or just use a tripod fixed camera, set the camera sensitivity lowish, and then do a star trail on both planets, because that will allow you to see the colour of both planets come out really well.
Yes.
So you can test whether Jupiter does indeed look yellowish and what the colour of Uranus looks like.
Green. Cyan.
Green,
cyan and grey. All right, well, the final planet, Neptune, not visible this month, so that's
That was quick.
that.
Yes, that's right. Okay, well, let's go into the specials then, because there are some nice solar system specials occurring. We've got the possibility, now you have to take this with a bit of a pinch of salt, okay, of a naked eye comet. Now, a number of people I've spoken to recently, when the mention of a naked eye comet, they expect a comet to be there that you can see with the naked eye. That's not what a naked eye comet actually means.
No.
Technically. It means that its magnitude is going to be above the threshold of naked eye visibility. But that's its integrated magnitude. That's taking the full comet glow and squishing it to a point source equivalent to a star. So in reality, the surface brightness of a comet will be lower than its predicted magnitude value, and that will make it harder to see. And Comet 12P Pons Brooks, which is the one we're talking about, will be in the evening twilight. Now, it's best at the beginning of April, because that's when you can see it against darker skies. But as you start to go through towards the second half of April, that's when the evening twilight will creep up and it will hide it, unless it does something unusual and bursts into life, like it has done in the past, hasn't it?
Well, so that's actually not a very unreasonable suggestion. I remember not long, well, I think it was November, December time when it last went into outburst, and it got incredibly bright telescopic wise. I had struggled to see it the night before with my 12-inch telescope, and then I got a call from Nick James, the British Astronomical Association Comet Section Director, who said it's gone into outburst, and it wasn't properly dark, and I turned the telescope onto it, and it looked like a fuzzy globular cluster. So it had gone from something like magnitude 13 down to magnitude 8 in a couple of hours. It was
that's
really quite
encouraging.
something.
And that's not the only time it's done it, is it? It's done it several times.
That's right.
So that's encouraging. And also, the other encouraging thing is that perihelion for 12P Pons Brooks will be on the 21st of April. So that's when it will be at the closest point to the sun in its orbit. So it's then getting as much energy as it will ever get from the sun, which might again trigger an outburst.
Yep. So you just never know. I always say you shouldn't expect them to be too bright, and then if they are, that's a nice bonus. But they're interesting objects, regardless of whether they reach naked eye visibility or not. They are lovely objects to follow with binoculars or a telescope, and always unpredictable to some extent. So they're well worth observing, even if they're overhyped in the media or whatever. Ignore that. Go out and observe them and enjoy them anyway, because they are fascinating objects in their own right.
Well, I think the interesting thing to point out is that even if it is classed as a naked eye comet, don't go out expecting to see a naked eye comet. Use binoculars and see if you can find it with those.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, well, so we'll keep our eyes peeled for that. But on the 8th of April, there will be a slim partial eclipse, which may be visible from the western regions as the sun sets. In fact, Pete and myself are going off to Texas to see the total eclipse. It would, of course, be very nice if the comet had a massive outburst, because then it would be visible at the time of totality. But we'll have to wait and see. But the slim partial eclipse may be visible on the 8th of April from the UK.
Yes, and it occurs as the sun is setting. Now, you have to be very careful with a setting sun because its light gets dimmed by a thicker layer of atmosphere, gets attenuated, and it looks quite harmless, but actually it can still be quite dangerous for your eyes.
Yes.
So use proper protection for your eyes. If you want to use a camera to take a picture, you should use a certified solar safety filter to do that. People will take the risk, but if you do, it's your own risk. Bear that in mind. You could damage your equipment, but if you do it, the trick is to wait until the sun is really low down, and then don't keep the equipment pointing at the sun for an extended period of time. Don't use a massive telescope to do it, because you're just inviting trouble if you do that.
Yeah.
And just play safe. Do not look through the viewfinder of your camera to try and locate the sun. Use the screen on the back of your camera. So if something goes wrong, you've wrecked your camera, but your eyes are still intact.
Yeah, I always say, with regards to the sun, it only takes a second's look to do a lifetime's worth of damage. So really be very careful.
Absolutely right.
Okay, well, moving on to the 11th of April. So at 2200 hours BST, or 9 o'clock UT in the evening, the 12% lit waxing crescent moon 3.7 degrees from the Pleiades open cluster. So
that's always a nice thing.
It is a nice thing.
Well, there's another cluster actually getting a visit from the moon on the evening of the 16th of April, when a 60% lit waxing gibbous moon sits 3.3 degrees northeast of Messier 44, the Beehive cluster. The moon's getting brighter then compared to how it will appear near the Pleiades, so it'll be harder to see the stars of the cluster. So again, binoculars are probably the best way to see that.
Yeah. And then on the 18th, we have a very easy to see phenomena. This is the dual handle lunar Claire obscura effect, which can be seen on this evening. And it occurs when the curved Jura Mountains, they catch the rays of the sun in the lunar dawn. And it is quite a striking phenomenon. It's well worth having a look at if you've never seen it before.
It is. And then, of course, we break the sparseness of meteor activity since the quadrantids at the beginning of January. The first major shower occurs this month. It's the annual Lyrid Meteor Shower, and that peaks on the 22nd of April. But I would say don't get too excited about that, because there's going to be a bright moon in the way, and it's going to make viewing the Lyrids pretty unfavourable, unfortunately. Yeah,
so that's a shame, but never mind. We'll just have to
At least it'll be clear, won't it?
Well, I don't know how you can say that based on previous evidence. I think it's much more likely not to be, but we'll hope for the best.
Okay, well, let's go out into the stars now, and we'll start by looking north, or rather northeast this month, where you'll find the brilliant summer star, Vega, and another summer star, Deneb. They'll be fairly low down in the earlier part of the night, but they form the top of the giant asterism known as the summer triangle. So that's a bit of wishful thinking, knowing that summer is on its way. Vega is the brightest star in the constellation of Lyra, the Lyre, and if you look carefully, just pick out the distinctive squashed diamond of stars which hang below it, and that represents the body of the musical instrument known as the lyre. Although they get quite low, neither Vega nor Deneb actually set from the UK. They're both circumpolar. And Deneb, of course, is the brightest star in the constellation of Cygnus. It sits on the northern part of the asterism known as the Northern Cross. And that's interesting because there's another comet which is travelling up the Northern Cross during the month of April. And that is going to be C 2021 S3 PANSTARRS. Now that comet isn't going to be anywhere near as bright as 12P Pons Brooks. It's about magnitude 9 at the end of April, but again, that's something worth looking out for.
It is, and this is the other thing about this, is that Cygnus is a very rich star field because one of the spiral arms of the galaxy passes through it.
Yes.
And one of the things that's great fun to do, well, I particularly like doing it, is estimating magnitudes of comets. It's quite difficult because you have to defocus the telescope so the stars are of the similar sort of diameter to the comet to make the comparison. But often comets appear in sort of sparse regions of the sky, and making those comparisons is very difficult. But as it's passing through Cygnus, there'll be plenty to choose from. So
yes, there will. So catch that sort of a bit closer towards the onset of dawn, just before dawn starts, because that's when the Northern Cross will be getting larger, or higher rather, in the sky. If you look overhead in the hours running up to midnight at this time of year, you'll find a really familiar pattern, or another asterism, which is the Plough or saucepan. That's virtually overhead, and that pattern is formed by 7 middle brightness stars, and it's really easy to recognise. Even you can do that, can't you, Paul?
I can just about do it with the go-to, yes.
With the go-to.
It is a very distinctive shape, as you say. And one of the things about it is because it's circumpolar, it never sets. It's interesting how its configuration appears to change over the course of the year. So sometimes it's quite low down, and other times it's quite overhead, looking almost like a question mark. So it is interesting how through the seasons it slightly changes how it looks slightly.
That's a really good point, actually, because I've never seen it as a question mark, but you're quite right, it does look like a question mark.
So the really useful thing about the Plough is using it to find the pole star. And the way to do that is to start with the pan of the saucepan and locate the 2 stars furthest away from the handle. And the upper star is called Dubhe, the lower star is Merak. And if you extend a line from Merak to Dubhe and keep going on, you'll come to the pole star, the North Star, which marks the north celestial pole of the sky. So it's very useful to be able to do that.
And drop a vertical from Polaris, the pole star, you'll come to the north point on the horizon if you're in the northern hemisphere.
Absolutely.
If you're not in the northern hemisphere, then you won't see it at all. But yeah, it's quite useful. And Polaris is quite an interesting star because it marks the position of the projected line of the Earth's rotational axis into the night sky for the northern hemisphere. But it doesn't quite mark it properly. It's a little bit away from it. So over the course of a night, it actually describes a tiny circle around that point, the North Celestial Pole. But even so, it's close enough to it. So if you do locate it, as Paul described, and drop a vertical to the horizon, that's good enough to be north.
Yeah, one of the things I often point out to people who have equatorial mounts, most equatorial mounts today come with a polar scope finder. And if you look through it, you can see the pole star. What you'll notice in those in the polar finder is that there is usually a little red or black circle which the pole star sits on, and it is the bit in the centre which is actually the North Celestial Pole. So that's why in the polar scope the North Pole star doesn't lie right in the centre. It's on this little circle.
Absolutely right. And of course, we should mention that Dubhe and Merak, which you mentioned in Ursa Major, in the Plough, or the saucepan, whatever you want to call it, are also known as the pointers because they point at the pole star, Polaris. The shape of the saucepan actually is echoed by the smaller bear. So Ursa Major is the large bear, the Great Bear, and it's the backside and tail of the Great Bear which is indicated by the 7 stars in the saucepan or the plough. I'll call it the saucepan because actually saucepan's a lot easier for people to recognise. People have a go at me for calling it the saucepan. They say, "Oh, it should be called the plough," but it's actually an asterism, which is an unofficial pattern. So you can call it whatever you like. It just has to stick. So it's a sticking saucepan. So
the French used to call the constellation La Casserole. So it's not that. It looks more like a saucepan than a plough, to be honest.
It certainly
so
does.
I think it's a perfectly rational thing to do, Pete.
Okay, well, the saucepan shape echoes the shape of Ursa Minor, the little bear, and Polaris sits at the end of the little bear's saucepan handle, if you want to call it. It's the end of the tail of the little bear, and you've got a box which is attached to that line of stars, which curves away from the North Pole, the North Celestial Pole, and 2 of the stars in there are they go by the name of the Guardians of the Pole, and the brighter of those 2 is Kokab, which is distinctly orange in shape, in colour.
Yes, it is quite a pretty star, and if we return to the saucepan, we can use the 2 stars that form the left-hand side of the pan, so the 2 closest to the handle, as reverse pointers to find another constellation that we see in spring. So if we extend the line formed by this pair in the opposite direction to Polaris until you come to a fairly bright star that lies just less than 2 saucepan lengths away, this is the star Regulus, the brightest star in Leo the Lion. And it sits at the base of this backward question mark asterism known as the sickle.
There's a lot of question marks in the sky.
There are, aren't there? Quite a few question marks in the sky. The second star up from Regulus, which sits in the sickle asterism, is Algeba. It's rather nice. In fact, it's a double star if you look at it through a telescope. So quite nice.
It is. It's an interesting thing with Algeba because you can look at it and there is a star really close to it and you think, that's the double.
Yeah.
It's not. That's 40 Leonis. The actual double is a bit harder than that, so you need a telescope to see it. The body of Leo heads off to the east of the sickle in a roughly rectangular shape, ending with a sharp triangle, the tip of which is marked by the star Denebula. And if you keep going east from Leo, and if your skies are nice and dark, you should be able to see a lovely shimmering mass of stars, which is the open cluster Malot 111, which is part of the constellation of Coma Berenices, or Queen Berenice's hair. It's not particularly big, the constellation, but there are plenty of deep sky objects on offer there.
Yes.
If you've got binoculars, you can pick up Malot 111 very easily. But there's also the globular cluster M53, which sits very close to the Alpha star, which is only magnitude plus 4.3, so it's quite dim. But it's got a lovely name. It's called Diadem.
That is a nice name. That globular cluster that you mentioned, M53, is actually quite a pretty one.
Yes, it is.
I do quite like globular clusters, and I think M53 is actually quite a good one and quite easy to find because it is, as you say, very close to the main star in Coma Berenices. Now, we should also say that between Diadem and Denebula lies the northern region of the very enigmatically named Realm of the Galaxies.
Yes.
And in this region, you'll find all manner of galaxies in all different shapes, sizes, and brightness. And in fact, it's a good way to tick up. You could practically polish half the Messier catalogue just by sweeping through this area with binoculars or a small telescope.
Tell me about it. I do a lot of the star charts in the magazine, and whenever this region is covered, my little sinking feeling goes on inside because there are so many galaxies here. It's a fantastic area to look at through a telescope because you can galaxy hop from one galaxy to another, and that's amazing. There are a couple here. There's the Coma and the Virgo galaxy clusters in this region, and at the heart of the Virgo cluster lies the massive elliptical M87, which is massive. It's about 120,000 light years in diameter, which is quite immense.
It is. It's quite an impressive sight, actually, in large telescopes from a dark site. It appears, when you look at it, to look flat, and its stars are confined to the central disks. But Really, it's quite a different type of galaxy to a spiral galaxy. In spiral galaxies, we have these spiral arms around a core, and it's all rotating around. Elliptical galaxies are structured rather differently, and they don't have this characteristic rotation curve that you see in spiral galaxies.
Well, the realm of galaxies is mostly located in Virgo, and the way to find the brightest star in Virgo is to go back to our old friend, the saucepan, and extend the handle of the saucepan, arc it round away from the pan, and you go through the bright orange star, which is Arcturus, the brightest star in Boötes the herdsman. Keep going on that arc, and you will eventually arrive at the bright white star, which is Spica. Which is the brightest star in Virgo. And if you wait for Arcturus, well, Arcturus is always fairly high in the spring, but wait for Spica to get a reasonable altitude, and then compare the colour of those two stars.
Yeah, you see that there is quite a difference. Spica's quite white, and Arcturus is really noticeably orange, and that's because these stars are very different ages. Arcturus is coming towards the end of its life now and has become a red giant. Spica is a hot young star, which is fairly new in cosmological terms. So that's the reason for the different colours.
Well, the saucepan could be used again, actually. If you imagine the arc of the handle, which I've just described, as a part of a circle, roughly where the centre of that circle will be, you've got the star Corcaroli, which is part of Canes Venatici, the hunting dogs. Interesting constellation, because there are only two stars there marking the hunting dogs, so you have to have a bit of imagination to pick that one out. But there are quite a few interesting deep sky objects in this region. If you imagine the midpoint of the line joining the two principal stars together, which is Corcaroli and Chara, and look just to the north of that midpoint, there's the spiral galaxy known as M94. And then if you go up close to the end of the saucepan's handle, you've got the very famous one, haven't you? M51, the Whirlpool.
Yeah, that's quite a nice galaxy. This was first made famous, really, by Lord Rosse with his telescope in Ireland, in Burr. He was the first, really, to see the spiral structure within M51, and from that, people began to realise that perhaps there was a lot more to galaxies than just them being fuzzy patches of gas.
It's got an interacting companion as well, NGC 5195, which it's not too difficult to see, to be honest.
No, it's not.
No, it's good. It stands out pretty well. But then if you go, let's go back to Arcturus. You know how to find that. You follow the arc to Arcturus, the arcing handle of the saucepan, and then locate Corcaroli, the star almost at the centre of the circle marked by the arcing handle of the saucepan, and then look at the midpoint between those two stars. That's where you'll find another lovely globular. You must have observed this one, Paul, M3.
It is a lovely sight, and I do actually prefer M3 to M13 because I think it seems to be slightly more compact and slightly easier to see than M13. Everyone goes on about M13 in Hercules being the great globular cluster, but I think really that should go to M3. I've always thought that.
Yeah, well, my favourite is M5.
Which is in Serpens.
That's correct, yes. I think that's a rather lovely globular cluster. And M2 is good, actually, in Aquarius. I think, some good examples out there. Okay, well, I think we've probably waffled on enough this month. So if we have clear skies and the clouds do eventually part, get outside. You won't see many planets, but there's plenty to see in the night sky regardless. So thank you very much, Paul.
Thanks, Pete.